Burgos, Spain, September 1506. After a match of tennis, King Philip I of Castile drinks a glass of cold water. Days later, he is dead. A fever takes him fast. His body decays before burial. Rumors spread: typhoid, poison, treachery. Behind him, he leaves a kingdom unguarded and a wife who would never be free again. This is not just the story of a death. It is the quiet collapse of power, all starting with a cup no one thought to question. Before he was a king, before he was a corpse, Philip was a mirror. A boy of mirrors, really, polished, golden, and shining in every direction he was turned. But mirrors do not reflect what's inside. And from the beginning, Philip was crafted to shine, not to feel. He was born in 1478 in Bruges, the jewel of Burgundy. His mother was Mary of Burgundy, the richest heiress in Europe. His father was Archduke Maximilian of Austria, ambitious, sharp-tongued, and always in motion. Philip was their only son, born in the thick of dynastic chaos, just days before Mary died after falling from a horse. He was not even 5 when the ducal crown was placed upon his little head. A child in mourning robes, standing beneath tapestries of lions and blood. The Burgundian court didn't raise children. It sculpted heirs. He grew up under the eyes of tutors, bishops, generals. He learned French, Latin, and courtly charm. He could ride before he could read. He could dance before he could speak in full sentences. And always, they said, he smiled. That was his weapon. Not strategy, not steel, but smiles. From an early age, Philip knew how to disarm a room by simply entering it. When he walked into a hall, noblemen bowed lower than they had to. Ladies blushed faster than they meant to. Servants stood straighter. He had that rare and dangerous quality, the illusion of innocence, gilded in charisma. They called him Philip the Handsome, and they meant it literally. Blonde hair, blue eyes, broad shoulders from hours of jousting. Skin unscarred by war, lips always slightly curled as if he were in on a joke no one else could hear. But this beauty was not a gift. It was a requirement. He was Burgundy's future, and Burgundy was no longer safe. His childhood was not lived. It was negotiated. His father, Maximilian, was constantly fighting off rebellion. The Low Countries, Spain, France, they all watched the young Duke of Burgundy like wolves at the edge of a forest. And Maximilian, ever the calculating Habsburg, understood that Philip's body could win what his armies could not. Marriage, alliance, control. For Philip, charm became a form of survival. From his earliest years, Philip absorbed a dangerous lesson. Politics is theater, and he was born to be the stage. At 12, he already presided over court sessions. At 14, he was corresponding with foreign ambassadors. But all the while, his father ruled through him. Maximilian, always writing from afar, always reminding his son, "You are Austria. You are Burgundy. You are mine." But Philip was not Maximilian. Where the father was cold and calculating, the son was warm, but shallow. He knew how to impress, but not how to listen. He could win admiration, but not loyalty. His talents lay in the glitter, not the groundwork. The courtiers around him began to whisper, "He is like gold leaf, beautiful, thin, and easily torn." Still, he was loved, or at least desired. The nobles of Flanders adored his charm, his elegance, his lack of severity. They threw tournaments in his honor. They laced his gloves with perfume. He became not just a prince, but a symbol of refinement after decades of war. But all symbols are vulnerable. By the time he turned 16, plans for his marriage were well underway. Maximilian had struck a brilliant deal with the Catholic monarchs of Spain. Philip would wed their daughter, Joanna of Castile. It was perfect on paper. Spain was rising. Burgundy needed an ally. And Joanna, second daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, was healthy, intelligent, and pious. But there was something no one calculated. Joanna had a heart, and Philip, trained in performance, had none to offer back. The wedding took place in 1496. He was 18, Joanna was 16. When they first met in Lier, it was said she fell for him instantly. There are tales, half romantic, half tragic, that Joanna demanded to consummate the marriage that very night, that she refused to wait for ceremony or protocol, that she threw herself toward him like a star caught in gravity. Philip? He enjoyed her devotion, for a while. But it was a meal he quickly found cloying. As Philip grew into manhood, he did not grow into depth. His power increased, but so did his detachment. He surrounded himself with Flemish advisors, dismissing the Spanish as rigid and alien. He spent more time in tournaments than in councils. He flirted, feasted, hunted. The kingdom? That was someone else's responsibility. And still, he smiled. But behind the facade, cracks were forming. Letters show that his relationship with his father soured. Maximilian scolded him for recklessness, for overreaching. A prince, he warned, must know when to bow and when to bite. Philip had learned to bow, but he had never learned to bite without being bitten back. By 1500, a new tension was in the air. Queen Isabella of Castile was aging. Joanna had given birth to sons. Spain, once just a distant land through a marriage contract, was now real and up for inheritance. Philip sensed it. He smelled power like others smell wine. But he did not understand its weight. His charm, once a shield, was about to become a trap. And as he stepped closer to Spain, he stepped closer to something colder, older, and far more ruthless than he was prepared for. A kingdom not ruled by affection, but by iron. A wife not content to be an ornament. A throne not given, but fought over, with silence, suspicion, and perhaps a cup of water. The match had been made by diplomats, but the damage would be done by desire. When Joanna of Castile arrived in Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome, she came with every expectation of protocol, except the one thing no court had prepared her for: love. She fell hard, not with calculation, not with cool dynastic ambition, but with the terrifying purity of someone who had never been taught to restrain her soul. From the moment she met Philip in Lier in 1496, it was as if her world narrowed to a single point: his face. Accounts tell us she was struck speechless at the sight of him. And he, amused and flattered, was not displeased. Their wedding was rushed. Their consummation was immediate. And for a time, all seemed ablaze with youth and beauty. But love, when unbalanced, becomes a blade. And Joanna was holding the sharp end. Philip was not built for intimacy. He had grown up in the theater of statecraft, not the chambers of affection. He had been taught how to bow, but not how to bend. In Joanna, he found a wife who adored him. Too much. She clung to him. She needed him. And while this might have pleased his vanity, it quickly wearied his heart. By temperament, Philip was cold. Not cruel, not violent, just distant. His charm had always been his shield, but Joanna pierced it, constantly, urgently, painfully. And when she cried, he closed. When she begged, he dismissed. And when she raged, because yes, she raged, he grew colder still. Joanna began to unravel. Her jealousy became legendary. She watched Philip with hawk-like intensity. If he smiled too long at a lady at court, Joanna would weep, scream, even strike her rivals. There is one account of her cutting the hair of a maid she suspected of flirting with the king. Another tells of her bursting into his chambers late at night to demand proof of his fidelity. Always the same refrain: "Do you love me, or do you lie?" Philip was not faithful. He did not try to be. Adultery was common among royalty, but Joanna could not endure it. She was not a political creature. She loved like a woman, not a queen. And in Philip's indifference, she found not just betrayal, but madness. Was she mad? The question remains debated. But what is clear is that the court began to say she was. In those years, Philip's court in the Low Countries became a world of rumors. Spanish envoys sent letters back to Ferdinand and Isabella expressing alarm. One wrote, "The queen suffers great distress when the king is not near. She eats little, weeps much, and grows pale with suspicion." Meanwhile, Philip surrounded himself with Flemish advisors who despised the Spanish. He left Joanna isolated. She was mocked for her accent, her piety, her moods. She became a ghost in her own household, hovering behind curtains, weeping behind walls, always watching. The once joyful bride now wore sorrow like a second skin. And Philip, for all his elegance, did nothing. By 1500, they had several children. Charles, the future emperor, had been born in Ghent. But motherhood brought Joanna no peace. She was often pregnant, often alone, and often afraid. In letters, she writes of being kept away from Philip, of being shut from his rooms, of her children being taken from her arms by attendants loyal to his advisors. These were not the acts of a husband. These were the acts of a court trying to smother a queen without a scandal. And yet, through it all, Joanna loved him. Obsessively, defiantly, fatally. Love in Joanna was not a gentle current. It was a flood, and floods, left unchecked, destroy all things in their path: reputation, stability, self-control. She could not play the game of distance. She could not pretend indifference. And the more she gave, the less he responded. Philip began traveling more, leaving her behind, holding court without her, laughing with other women, discussing politics with men who hated her. He was building a world where she had no place. This was no longer a marriage. It was a stage for humiliation. There is a chilling moment recorded in 1504. Joanna had accompanied Philip to a public procession in Brussels. She reached for his hand as they stepped into the light of the crowd. He pulled away. She flinched, but smiled. A queen cannot falter in front of her subjects. But behind her smile, a storm was gathering. That same year, Isabella of Castile, Joanna's mother, fell gravely ill. Her death would mean the throne of Castile passed to Joanna. This should have made her powerful. Instead, it made her a target. Philip saw opportunity, not to defend Joanna's claim, but to use it. He did not want her beside him. He wanted her beneath him, legally, politically, symbolically. When Isabella died in 1504, Ferdinand of Aragon tried to assert regency over Castile. Joanna, now queen in her own right, had the stronger claim. But Philip was determined to take control himself. He declared his wife unfit to rule. He began calling himself King of Castile by right of marriage. He denied her audiences, spoke for her in letters, used her name, but silenced her voice. And the world began to listen. The marriage that began with fire had turned to frost. Joanna was now both queen and prisoner, beloved and dismissed. She loved the man who betrayed her. She carried the air of a kingdom that no one would let her touch. And as her voice cracked under the weight of grief, the courtiers whispered, "The queen is not well." But perhaps the madness was never hers alone. Perhaps it belonged to a world that demanded obedience from women and detachment from men. A world where grief was weakness, love was foolishness, and a wife who cared too much was simply a danger to be contained. Joanna's mind was unraveling. But it had been pulled loose by many hands, and none of them were hers. On November 26, 1504, Queen Isabella of Castile, one of the most formidable monarchs in Europe, took her last breath in Medina del Campo. She was 53 years old. Her death shook the Iberian Peninsula to its core. She left behind a vast and unified realm. But more dangerously, she left behind a daughter whose mind was cracking, and a son-in-law who smelled opportunity like a hound in blood. Joanna was now Queen of Castile in name, in body, in law. But law, in early modern Europe, was a fragile thing, especially when written in the hands of men. Ferdinand of Aragon, Isabella's widower, had no intention of giving up control. Despite his daughter's inheritance, Ferdinand saw himself as the natural ruler. He had led wars, forged alliances, crushed rebellions. Joanna, to him, was a child, not a queen. Her mental instability, real or exaggerated, became the lever he would use. He immediately had the Castilian Cortes recognize him as governor and administrator of the kingdom in Joanna's name. He was not king, but he was everything else. This decision enraged Philip. Thousands of miles away in the Low Countries, Philip the Handsome read the news with clenched teeth. His wife was now queen, which meant, he believed, he was now king. But Ferdinand stood in the way, a father-in-law, a political rival, a man who knew how to play long games and win them. Philip, impulsive and proud, would not tolerate that. And so began the Cold War for Castile. Philip and Joanna set sail for Spain in the spring of 1506. The journey was not easy. Storms battered their ship and forced them to land in England for weeks. It was a delay, but not a defeat. The moment they stepped onto Spanish soil, Philip began acting as sovereign. He issued decrees, held court, received homage. He referred to himself not as consort, but as King of Castile. Joanna, by contrast, was often absent, sick, grieving, distracted. She traveled with him, but rarely ruled beside him. Her presence was symbolic, her voice muffled. To the people of Castile, Philip was not Spanish. He was Burgundian, foreign, elegant, yes, but unfamiliar. His manners were smoother than Ferdinand's, his clothes finer, his processions grander, but his hands were colder. He did not speak their tongue. He did not kneel at their altars. He was charming, but distant. And charm, without roots, rarely holds up against stone. The cities of Castile were divided. Some nobles pledged loyalty to Philip. Others remained faithful to Ferdinand. Whispers filled the taverns and cathedrals. Was Joanna truly mad? Could she reign, or was she a puppet of whichever man happened to be closest to her crown? In one documented episode in Valladolid, Joanna demanded a seat at a council Philip had tried to exclude her from. She entered the room and stood, trembling, eyes wide, lips bloodless, then declared, "I am queen, and I will be heard." Philip refused to let her speak. Instead, he had the doors shut in her face. That image would haunt her for years. A queen with a sealed mouth, standing before the men who ruled her kingdom without her. Tensions with Ferdinand reached a boiling point. Each side issued conflicting proclamations. Each claimed legitimacy. Philip's supporters portrayed him as the rightful king through marriage. Ferdinand's envoys denounced him as an ambitious outsider exploiting a vulnerable woman. Philip's view of Ferdinand hardened into hatred. He referred to him in letters as the old fox, a manipulator clinging to power. Ferdinand, in turn, mocked Philip's youth, vanity, and arrogance. And caught between them was Joanna. Not seen, not heard, used. In June 1506, a fragile peace was reached. A treaty signed at Villafafila temporarily settled the dispute. Ferdinand would step aside and return to Aragon. Philip would rule Castile as king, but only with Joanna. The agreement stated explicitly, she remained sovereign. He could act only as her equal. But Philip had no intention of honoring that. Within days, he took full control of government. He issued proclamations in his own name. Joanna was hidden from view, paraded when useful, silenced when not. To the world, she was slipping into madness. But to some observers, it was grief, not madness. Grief weaponized, grief disbelieved. Her voice was framed as hysteria, her defiance as lunacy, her isolation as proof of incapacity. Philip, meanwhile, had what he wanted, a throne. And yet, the air around him grew colder. He was no longer in Burgundy, where courtiers bowed to his style. He was in Castile now, where power was earned with iron and fire, not silk and flattery. He tried to replace the Castilian ministers with Flemish favorites. The old nobles resisted. The people muttered in marketplaces. Priests frowned in sermons. And Joanna, mad or not, continued to appear in unexpected places, weeping, demanding, accusing. In one account, she found Philip with another woman and collapsed in the corridor, screaming so loudly the palace guards rushed to her side. He did not comfort her. He told the servants to remove her. Another chronicler writes that Joanna, in the middle of a court ball, grabbed a goblet of wine, smashed it, and cried, "This is how my heart breaks in his hands." These were not the theatrics of royalty. These were the symptoms of despair. Philip had seized the crown, but he had lost the court. His enemies were multiplying. His allies were uneasy. Even his body began to show signs of strain. He grew pale, restless, irritable. In meetings, his hands trembled. He complained of heat, then cold. He refused food at banquets. And yet, he pressed forward. He rode out with his hunting parties. He played tennis. He reviewed troops. A crown had cost him his wife's sanity, his people's trust, and his peace. But it wasn't done taking yet. By the summer of 1506, Castile had a king who ruled like a foreign prince. A queen who wandered palace corridors in silence or storms of grief. And a court caught in the eye of a storm no one dared name. What had begun as a political partnership had decayed into a public spectacle. Philip the Handsome, once admired for his charm and polish, was now known for his contempt, both for Spanish custom and for the queen whose title he used like a key. Joanna, Queen of Castile by right of inheritance, was reduced to an image. A shadow in silks, a woman too loud to be ignored, too wounded to be heard. She was not just dismissed, she was undermined. It is important to understand this. Joanna's unraveling was not sudden. It was strategic, slow, public. In a royal court, you do not need to depose a queen to destroy her authority. You only need to make her look unstable, once, twice, then every day. Let her grief play out in public. Let her devotion look hysterical. Let the court whisper not, "She is sad," but "She is mad." And Philip understood this performance perfectly. He humiliated her with precision. At a formal court gathering in August 1506, Joanna entered the hall wearing mourning colors, black and deep gray, for her mother, Queen Isabella. Philip, dressed in a bright crimson doublet, made a spectacle of his cheer. As the queen approached, he turned away mid-conversation, smiled at his advisors, and continued laughing. She stood there for minutes, unnoticed, while courtiers bowed to the man beside her. She then collapsed. Not metaphorically, physically. She fell to the stone floor, sobbing, whispering his name. He didn't kneel. He didn't speak. He simply walked out of the room. There were more moments like this, documented in court letters, chroniclers' notes, and ambassadorial reports. Joanna was said to roam the palace at night, barefoot, looking for Philip. She would knock on doors, crying out his name. She once entered the chambers of a servant girl rumored to have caught his eye and tore down the curtains, screaming that the devil had taken her place. And the court watched. Some pitied her, most ridiculed her, but none stopped what was happening. Because as long as Joanna was unstable, Philip was unchallengeable. The political theater reached its height in early September. Philip summoned the Castilian Cortes to formally acknowledge him as King of Castile. Joanna was expected to appear at his side, silently endorsing his reign. She refused. He sent guards to bring her. What happened next was recorded by multiple sources. Joanna entered the chamber disheveled, pale, her hair half unpinned beneath her veil. She stood beside Philip, but refused to take his hand. When the oath was read, she did not speak. When the nobles pledged loyalty, she turned away. Philip tried to pull her back toward him. She slapped his hand and cried out, "They are not yours, they are mine." Silence fell like a guillotine. Philip signaled the guards. They led her out. She did not return to court again. After that moment, the queen became invisible, but her absence echoed louder than her presence. Rumors flew across Castile that she had been imprisoned, that she had gone mad, that she had tried to poison herself. The truth was simpler and crueler. She had been locked in a room in Tordesillas, not as a criminal, not as a monarch, but as a problem. Philip told the court she was unwell. His advisors told the Cortes she was resting. The clergy were told she was suffering from an affliction of the spirit. No one used the word madness yet, but it hung in the air like a stench. And all the while, Philip ruled alone. He had finally achieved what he wanted. But his triumph was bitter. The people were restless. The nobility was divided. The alliance with the Low Countries was strained. Even foreign ambassadors began to question his behavior. One Venetian envoy wrote, This king has the smile of a saint and the hands of a butcher. He does not rule with strength. He rules with mirrors. His court was a theater of elegance, but behind the velvet curtains, the walls were cracking. And then, as if summoned by the gods of irony, Philip's own body began to fail him. He started complaining of fatigue, of heat. Then chills. He lost his appetite. His advisors thought it was exhaustion. The physicians thought it was anxiety. But it was something else. A small, unnoticed moment. After a game of tennis, he drank a cold glass of water. What followed was swift. Fevers, vomiting, stomach pain so severe he reportedly screamed through the night. His face turned gray, his eyes sank, his lips cracked. And Joanna? She heard the screams, and she wept. Was it typhoid? Was it dysentery? Or was it poison? We do not know. Historians remain divided. Some point to the symptoms, classic of bacterial infection from unclean water. Others note that the timing was too convenient. That Ferdinand, having been driven out of Castile, had motive. That poison was easy to conceal. That enemies moved in silence. That cold water doesn't kill a king unless someone wanted it to. Still debated. But what is certain is this. Within a week, Philip was dead. At 28 years old, healthy, handsome, powerful, gone. And Castile trembled. Because the man who had torn down a queen, locked away a crown, and seized a kingdom had collapsed faster than he ever rose. The silence after his death was not mourning. It was confusion, suspicion, fear. Joanna, hearing the news, did not scream. She did not collapse. She simply asked to see the body. And when she did, she held his hand for hours. They say she whispered to it as if he were still alive. September 12, 1506. Valladolid. Under a pale Castilian sun, Philip stood at the height of his ambition. Draped in ceremonial robes of gold-threaded velvet, crowned with the weight of Castile, he was no longer just Philip the Handsome. He was now Philip I, King of Castile. The Cortes had yielded. The nobles had sworn allegiance. His name was etched into the royal charters. Joanna, silent, veiled, and seated beside him, was barely more than an accessory to the pageant. Her crown was real, but her power was not. Philip had won, or so it seemed, because just 9 days later, he would be dead. And all of Castile would whisper about the cup. The coronation was grand, but its foundations were fragile. Philip had ruled for mere months, but already enemies were stirring. His replacement of Castilian ministers with Flemish favorites had bred resentment. His treatment of Joanna, public, callous, and humiliating, had turned sympathy into suspicion. Even the church was uneasy. Behind the banners and fanfare, the kingdom held its breath. On the surface, Philip was radiant. He greeted nobles with confidence, paraded through towns on horseback, and hosted endless feasts. He played tennis each morning with his guards. He dined late, drank deep, and kissed babies in marketplaces. But something beneath the surface had begun to fray. According to several sources, the symptoms began innocuously. Fatigue, dry throat, a mild fever. His physicians prescribed rest and hydration. He ignored them. The critical moment came on September 18th. After a game of tennis, sweating and flushed, Philip reportedly asked for a drink of water. A servant brought him a goblet, cold, drawn from a nearby well. He drank it in one pull. What followed was immediate. Chills, then vomiting, then pain so sharp he doubled over. By evening, he was confined to bed, shaking with fever, unable to eat. His stomach swelled. His skin turned a waxen gray. Within 24 hours, he could barely speak. The royal household panicked. Physicians were summoned from all corners of the city. Some diagnosed dysentery, others whispered typhoid. A few blamed bad humors or foul air. But a darker whisper crept through the palace. Poison. Was the cup tampered with? Was the well contaminated? Was it a servant loyal to Ferdinand, slipped into the household with instructions to correct the line of succession? Still debated. There was no autopsy, no chemical test. Just a young man, a king, dying faster than anyone could explain. And a wife, locked in another room, clawing at the walls to be let in. Joanna demanded to see him. She begged the guards. She threatened the physicians. When she was finally allowed into his chamber, witnesses say she fell to her knees beside the bed and pressed his burning hand to her chest. "My love, who has done this to you?" she whispered. Philip looked at her, but did not speak. Whether he could not or would not remains a mystery. But some claim his eyes were filled with regret. By the third day, Philip was convulsing. His stomach bloated. His breath turned sour. His once beautiful face, so praised by courtiers and chroniclers, became disfigured by swelling, fever, and decay. He soiled himself repeatedly. His groans echoed through the palace. Doctors lanced his abdomen to release pressure, but it only worsened. A man once described as golden was rotting from the inside. And still, no answers. Was it the water, the food? An infection from the crowded, unsanitary travel through Spain? Or was it political? Ferdinand had motive. He had been pushed out of Castile, outmaneuvered by his son-in-law. Joanna had motive too, if one looked through the lens of madness. Even the nobles, increasingly disillusioned with Philip's foreign rule, had reason to be rid of him. But no poison was ever proven, no culprit ever named. Just a crown and a corpse. Philip died on September 25th, 1506, 13 days after his coronation. He was 28 years old. His reign had lasted only 2 months. His death left a kingdom in free fall, a queen in grief, and a legacy soaked in silence. But the tragedy did not end with death. Philip's body was handled with haste and horror. In their panic, the physicians and attendants embalmed him poorly, some say incompetently. His organs were removed, but improperly stored. His body swelled in the coffin, his features distorted. The king's face, once idolized, became unrecognizable within days. When Joanna was shown the coffin, she collapsed. When she woke, she asked that the casket be brought to her chambers, and there it remained. She did not bury him, not yet. She claimed she needed time, that the stars were not right, that his soul had not yet departed, that he still breathed in the silence between prayers. And so the coffin stayed, in her rooms, in her halls, accompanied by candles, by priests, by a queen who no longer spoke of governance, only of grief. What had begun as a political collapse was becoming something deeper, darker, intimate. The court looked on and said nothing. Outside the palace, the people of Castile were afraid. They had buried their queen's mother. Now their king was dead. And their queen? Locked away, whispering to a coffin. The empire was crumbling, and it had all begun with a cup of water. The death of King Philip I should have marked the end of a chapter. Instead, it opened a darker one, because his wife, Joanna of Castile, refused to let him go. While the court moved to arrange a burial, Joanna moved in the opposite direction. She did not order a tomb. She did not plan a procession. She did not allow the final prayers. She ordered his coffin sealed, then placed it beside her bed, not in ceremony, but in intimacy. The court was horrified. They pleaded with her. The nobles sent priests, advisors begged. But Joanna refused. "He is not dead," she whispered. "He is only sleeping. His soul lingers. I will not bury him among strangers." What had once been dismissed as melancholia was now undeniable. The Queen of Castile was keeping the corpse of her husband by her side, day and night. She spoke to it in low tones. She demanded it be moved when she traveled. She lit candles around it like a shrine. Grief had curdled into obsession. The stench was unbearable. Philip's body had not been embalmed properly. The internal organs were removed, but the preservation was rushed, botched, and incomplete. His flesh bloated and darkened. His face, once the most handsome in Europe, had become sunken, grotesque. The hands curled inward, the skin peeled. And yet, Joanna would not allow the casket to be closed in a vault or taken to a church. She opened it periodically, they said. She asked for fresh linen to be laid inside. She wept over the bruised hands. Once, she was seen kissing the top of the coffin as if it might respond. It did not. To many, it was madness. To others, it was the final rebellion of a woman who had been silenced too long. Her entire life, Joanna had been used as a bridge between kingdoms, between men, between dynasties. Her feelings had been a liability, her mind questioned, her crown claimed by others. But now, in this grotesque vigil, she was asserting power the only way left to her, by refusing to let go, by making death obey her terms. Joanna ordered the coffin moved from palace to palace as she traveled across Castile. The royal guards followed her at night, bearing the casket in solemn procession. When asked why she journeyed by moonlight, she responded, "Because the sun does not understand mourning." At one stop, she reportedly refused to allow any woman near the coffin, declaring, "No woman shall approach him but me. He was mine, and mine he remains." The tale of the Mad Queen and her corpse spread across the kingdom like wildfire. People whispered in churches, in markets, in streets. She sleeps beside him still. She talks to him in the dark. She feeds him wine through the coffin walls. Exaggerations, perhaps. But no one could deny the eerie truth. Philip's corpse remained above ground for nearly 2 years. Not buried, not entombed, not released. He became a ghost, not of legend, but of state. Foreign courts wrote in confusion. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, Philip's father, sent envoys urging burial. The Spanish nobles feared scandal. Even the clergy began to protest. Still, Joanna held firm. "He is not ready," she said. "The earth is too cold. He will cry in the ground." The political consequences were immense. With Philip gone, the kingdom should have passed to Joanna and their son, Charles. But Joanna's behavior now gave her enemies all the justification they needed. Ferdinand, her father, exiled by Philip just months before, returned to Castile in late 1506, cloaked in mourning and crowned in strategy. He declared Joanna unfit to rule. "She is a danger to herself and to the realm," he wrote. "Her mind is clouded by grief. The kingdom must not suffer the same fate." The Cortes, seeing the queen with a corpse in tow and an empty throne at court, agreed. They named Ferdinand regent once more. Joanna had been queen. Now she was a widow, and soon she would be a prisoner. In 1509, under quiet orders from Ferdinand, Joanna was escorted to the fortress of Tordesillas, not as a queen, but as a liability. The coffin came with her. Her rooms were sealed. Guards were posted. Visitors restricted. Outside, Spain entered its golden century. But inside, in a stone chamber above the Duero River, a woman still whispered to a box of bones. Joanna would remain there for the next 46 years. She never remarried. She never ruled again. And Philip? He was eventually buried, quietly, secretly, without the grandeur his coronation had promised. His body, by then, barely recognizable. Entombed beneath stone, he became a footnote to an empire he once tried to command. No marble statue was raised in his honor. No grand epitaph declared his legacy. Just silence. It is said that, in her final years, Joanna stopped speaking altogether. That she sat in a chair beside the sealed tomb, hands clasped, lips moving in prayer or memory. That sometimes she laughed. Sometimes she wept. Sometimes she asked if it was morning and whether Philip had opened his eyes yet. The court ignored her. The empire forgot her. But history did not. Because hers is not only the story of grief, it is the story of what happens when power is taken, love is used, and a crown becomes a coffin. Philip was gone, but he was not buried. Not truly, not in her mind, not in the echoes, not in the rot that settled over the throne he briefly wore. The bells had barely ceased tolling for Philip I when footsteps echoed back through Castile. Heavy, deliberate, and familiar. Ferdinand of Aragon, the old king, the widowed consort of Isabella, had returned. He did not wear armor. He did not raise an army. He came cloaked not in war, but in reason. "I come not as a conqueror," he told the Cortes, "but as a father." Yet his arrival was conquest all the same. Philip's death had left Castile leaderless. Joanna, the rightful queen, was secluded in mourning or madness in Tordesillas. Their son Charles was only 6 years old, being raised in the Low Countries. There was no king, no clear regent, only a widow speaking to a coffin and a vacuum. Ferdinand stepped into it with the precision of a man who had waited for the door to creak open. He wasted no time. Within weeks, he summoned the Cortes and made his case. Joanna, he said, was incapable. The evidence? Her refusal to bury her husband. Her night wanderings, her unresponsive silences. She was not a ruler. She was a relic. They agreed, unanimously. On August 17th, 1507, Ferdinand was formally recognized as governor and administrator of Castile. It was the title he had once claimed after Isabella's death. But this time, no one contested it. He ruled not in his daughter's name, but despite it. Joanna was never deposed. On paper, she remained queen. But the paper was signed by other hands, and her signature meant nothing. Tordesillas became her world, a fortress by the river, cold, gray, unforgiving. Her rooms were modest, even for a queen. A single chamber, one fireplace, a prayer book, iron-barred windows, and, beside her, the coffin. Though Philip had eventually been buried, Joanna insisted that a symbolic coffin remain near her. She called it mi consuelo, my comfort. She ate in silence, slept in silence. When attendants spoke to her, she sometimes answered. Sometimes, she simply stared. Outside, the kingdom stabilized. Ferdinand's return brought with it a return to order, at least on the surface. Nobles who had been ousted by Philip were restored. Flemish advisors were expelled, laws were reaffirmed, church relations were repaired. The Castilian court once again hummed with confidence, and the queen was no longer seen. Ferdinand did not hate his daughter. He visited her in Tordesillas, rarely, quietly, and without ceremony. Once, in 1510, he brought her young son Charles to meet her. She reportedly held the boy tightly, whispered prayers over him, and then refused to let him go. They had to pull him from her arms. Later, she asked if Philip had sent him. She was told yes. She smiled and did not speak again that day. But there was strategy beneath the sorrow. By keeping Joanna alive, but hidden, Ferdinand ensured continuity. He ruled as her regent, not her usurper. And when he died, the throne would pass to her son, Charles, cleanly, legally. It was a delicate illusion, a throne propped up by a ghost. And in time, that ghost would become empire. Ferdinand reigned as Castile's effective king for 9 more years. He remarried. His bride was a teenage French noblewoman, but no new heirs came. He forged new alliances, expanded Spain's power, and in 1516 died in Madrigalejo. His will made one thing clear: Joanna would remain imprisoned. Even in death, he did not trust her with the crown that was hers by birth. After Ferdinand's death, the regency passed to Cardinal Cisneros, who ruled briefly until young Charles of Ghent, Philip and Joanna's son, arrived from Flanders. He was 16, fluent in French and Dutch, barely able to speak Castilian. He was received with ceremony, proclaimed Charles I of Spain. But he did not visit his mother, not at first. Years later, Charles would finally enter the stone halls of Tordesillas. He found a pale, aged woman sitting in a dark room. She rose slowly, bowed her head, and said, "Mi hijo." He kissed her hand. She did not ask about the kingdom. She did not ask about her crown. She asked if Philip had come with him. He did not answer. Charles left her in that room. She would remain there, surrounded by nuns, candles, and fading memories, until her death in 1555. 76 years old, 46 of them in confinement. When she died, there were no proclamations, no public mourning. She was buried beside Philip, at last, in silence. But in her absence, a new empire had risen. Charles would become Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, Naples, and the New World. The greatest monarch of his time. And he would do so in a crown inherited from 2 ghosts, a mother who was silenced, and a father who drank cold water and died. This was the cost of empire. Not a war, not a revolution, but a marriage, a madness, and a quiet substitution of power. No one shouted, no one rebelled. The kingdom simply shifted, while the rightful queen sat behind a locked door, whispering to memories that no one else believed in. After the death of Philip I of Castile in 1506, and the long burial of his memory in the shadows of court politics, Spain did what empires often do. It moved on. Not with grace, not with healing, but with amnesia. history began to smooth the jagged edges of Philip's brief and bitter reign. His name remained in royal records, Philip I of Castile, but few remembered what he had truly done. Because the truth was uncomfortable, because the legacy was incomplete, because to remember Philip meant remembering the coffin that followed his widow from town to town, and the queen who spoke to silence for the rest of her life. And so the kingdom built something else in his place. They built Charles. Philip's son, Charles of Ghent, was transformed from a quiet, foreign-raised boy into a vessel of empire. His tutors taught him Castilian etiquette, Aragonese history, and the art of ruling in his grandfather's name. They downplayed the mother locked away in Tordesillas. They buried the father who had never ruled. When Charles arrived in Spain in 1517, the nobles barely mentioned Philip. His portraits had faded. His Flemish advisors, once powerful, were gone. His policies reversed. His customs foreign. The kingdom no longer belonged to the handsome stranger who drank cold water and died. It belonged to his shadow. It belonged to Charles. And so, Castile rose again, not on memory, but on erasure. Joanna remained alive, but invisible. Philip remained dead, but useful. The Habsburg claim to Spain, one of the most powerful political inheritances in European history, rested entirely on that brief marriage between Joanna and Philip. A union of blood, yes, but also of suffering. A woman deemed mad, a man who never truly ruled. Together they produced a lineage that would dominate Europe for centuries. And yet, they themselves were quietly scrubbed from glory. In official chronicles, Philip became a tragic figure. A noble prince cut down in his prime. No mention of betrayal, no mention of humiliation, no mention of the queen's screams in palace halls or the rumors of poison passed in silver cups. His body, once decaying above ground for years, was finally laid to rest beside Joanna in the royal chapel of Granada next to her parents, Ferdinand and Isabella. A marble tomb was eventually commissioned. It was quiet, modest, resigned. Inscribed were their names, but not their pain. In private, some at court whispered differently, that Philip had died not from fever, but from fear. That he had underestimated Castile and been consumed by it. That his beauty had been a disguise for political hollowness. That his reign collapsed because he saw monarchy as a role, not a responsibility. One courtier wrote in a private letter, "He spoke like a prince, moved like a prince, but thought like a courtier. He could not see the knives through the silks." Still others believed something more sinister, that Ferdinand had known, that the cold water was no accident, that Philip had been outmaneuvered, poisoned not just in body, but in legacy. Still debated, never proven, rarely spoken. And what of Joanna? Her legacy was even more twisted. To the Castilian people, she became Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, a cautionary tale, a symbol of feminine fragility, a story told in taverns and textbooks alike. She lost her mind for love. She kept his corpse by her bed. She wandered the roads with his coffin. But the truth was not so simple. Joanna was never proven insane in a legal court. She was never diagnosed by any physician of authority. She wrote letters. She spoke with clarity in interviews. She understood politics, but was denied all participation in it. Her so-called madness may have been grief, may have been depression, may have been real, but it was also convenient. For Ferdinand, for Charles, for the empire, because a silent queen is easier to rule through than a defiant one. And so, an empire was built, on the corpse of a king who ruled for 2 months, on the silence of a queen, imprisoned for 46 years, on a child who grew up to become Charles V, ruler of a realm where the sun never set, because it could not rest on the graves it ignored. Yet even within that glory, there were ghosts. Charles rarely spoke of his parents. He visited his mother sparingly. He honored his father with titles, not stories. But in his private chapel, he reportedly kept a portrait of both, painted before the madness, before the rot, before history hardened. In the painting, Philip smiles. Joanna sits at his side. They are young, together, untouched. Perhaps Charles needed to believe that version. Perhaps we all do. Centuries passed, and still, the marble tomb of Philip and Joanna sits in Granada, cold, quiet, unmoving. Visitors walk by, pointing at plaques, snapping photos, rarely pausing. Few know the full story, that beneath that stone lies a man who ruled nothing but a procession, a woman who loved too deeply and was punished for it, a marriage that produced an empire but cost 2 souls, and above it all, the silence of a nation that chose forgetting over reckoning. Philip the Handsome was not a king in the traditional sense. He did not command armies. He did not issue sweeping reforms. He did not conquer, legislate, or build. He barely ruled at all. And yet, his name became the linchpin of a vast imperial machine. Because Philip was not remembered for what he did. He was remembered for what he connected. He was the prince who joined Burgundy and Castile, the groom who tied the Habsburgs to the Trastamaras, the young man who, by virtue of a short marriage and a brief reign, linked the great houses of Europe into a single bloodline. And for that, he is in every royal genealogy. But not in many hearts. Born in Bruges in 1478, Philip was neither a Spanish prince nor an imperial heir. He was Burgundian, shaped by the etiquette, ceremony, and courtly pride of the Low Countries. Raised in the shadow of his mother's accidental death and his father's political machinations, Philip learned from an early age how to smile through uncertainty. He grew up in halls draped with tapestries, surrounded by tournaments, minstrels, and the delicate dance of power. His court was one of elegance, not efficiency. He learned to charm, not to govern, to pose, not to persevere. They called him handsome, graceful, refined. But no one called him formidable. When he married Joanna of Castile in 1496, he entered a world beyond his imagination. Spain was vast, disciplined, devout, and full of suspicion. The Burgundian court had taught him art and dance. But Spain demanded blood and fire. He did not adjust. He did not try. Philip treated the Spanish nobility as foreign inferiors. He replaced their advisors with his own. He ignored the religious gravitas of Castile, mocked their rigid etiquette, and dismissed their devotion to ceremony. To many in Spain, he was a gilded outsider, too perfect to trust, too polished to lead. And yet, for a brief moment in 1506, he wore the crown. Philip I, King of Castile, a title heavy with history, a realm that had taken centuries to unify, now placed in the hands of a man who preferred hunting dogs and silken doublets to legislation and diplomacy. He was a bridge. but he never learned how to hold the weight of what crossed him. He ruled for 2 months, long enough to sign a few decrees, to alienate the Castilian council, to sideline his wife, to offend the church, and to drink a glass of cold water. Then he was gone. But empires are not built only by those who endure. They are built by those whose bloodlines endure. And in this, Philip mattered more dead than alive. His marriage to Joanna produced Charles, who would become Charles I of Spain and later Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. Through Charles, Philip's legacy would stretch from the hills of Castile to the palaces of Vienna, from the Low Countries to the silver mines of the Americas. He would become the silent father of an empire. But he would remain silent. What did Philip believe in? We do not know. He left behind no manifestos, no treatises, no visions for governance. His letters were political and personal, not philosophical. He did not speak like a monarch with purpose. He spoke like a man performing monarchy. His actions suggest he valued 3 things. 1, image. He dressed as if the world were a mirror. Even at court meetings, he was said to carry perfumed gloves and wear gemstone-studded cloaks. 2, control. He dismissed those who challenged him, especially Joanna, especially Spanish officials. 3, distance. He did not involve himself deeply in any realm, not love, not politics, not legacy. He skimmed the surface of power, and that, perhaps, is why he cracked so easily. In contrast, those around him were forged in fire. Joanna, though deemed mad, was full of feeling, full of defiance, full of unbearable loyalty. Ferdinand, his father-in-law, was a hardened tactician. He ruled through structure, through strategy, through long games. Even Maximilian, Philip's own father, was a master of dynastic engineering, trading marriages like chess pieces. Philip had none of that. He was born in the space between duty and pleasure, between crowns and courts, between countries that wanted his body, but not his mind. He was a prince of silk in a world of knives. And when the knives came, disguised as fevers, as rejection, as cold glances from noblemen, he had no shield. His charm could not protect him. His marriage could not save him. His crown had no roots. Even after death, Philip remained in between. His corpse lingered above ground. His wife refused to bury him. His legacy hung in the air. Never quite condemned, never fully praised. He was not a martyr. He was not a tyrant. He was not a builder nor a breaker. He was a thread in a larger tapestry, gold and shining, yes, but not woven to last. And yet, without him there would be no Charles V, no Habsburg Spain, no empire on which the sun never set. The boy from Bruges, who once learned how to dance before he could speak, became the father of monarchs, the hinge on which history turned, quietly, quickly, fatally. Philip I of Castile reigned for 67 days, that's all. In a kingdom of warriors, saints, and inquisitors, his was the briefest shadow ever cast from a throne. And yet, in those 2 months, something quietly shattered. A queen collapsed. A marriage curdled into spectacle. A kingdom recoiled in confusion, and a dynasty began its rise on the cold marble slab that held his unburied corpse. What truly killed Philip? Was it typhoid from the cold water, as the physicians claimed? Was it poison slipped into a goblet by someone with motive and access? Was it the culmination of stress, ambition, and political recklessness in a foreign land he never tried to understand. Historians still debate. But history does not wait for certainty. It moves on, dragging bodies and truths alike. He was beautiful, but beauty never ruled. He was charming, but charm never saved a crown. Philip governed like a man playing dress-up. He wore power like he wore his clothes. Fine, flattering, but never heavy. He was born to link dynasties, not to lead them. He smiled at the fire until it burned through the floor. And when it did, he left behind a wife who screamed into silence, and a child who would rule the world. As the narrator of this story, I offer no indictment, only a meditation. Because this was not a tale of war or conquest. This was not the saga of a tyrant or a saint. This was something more fragile. A story about what happens when a person, young, adored, and untested, is placed on a throne they were never meant to carry. A story about how indifference can be just as deadly as cruelty. A story about a queen whose madness may have been nothing more than unfiltered grief, and a kingdom that found that inconvenient. We often imagine history's tragedies in fire and iron, but sometimes it's just a glass of water. A moment after tennis, a sip, a sickness, and the collapse of something too delicate to be real. Philip died at 28, and with him died the illusion that charm can replace character, that marriage can replace leadership, that beauty can hold a realm together when the weight of politics breaks through the floorboards. His story is a quiet warning about how crowns don't just gleam, they cut. About how power, when placed in the hands of those who don't feel its heat, tends to rot from within. About how some kings are not overthrown, they simply disappear, swallowed by silence, by sickness, by a cup that no one thought to question. And so, we ask, do empires fall with swords or with sips? Do queens go mad alone, or are they driven there? One humiliation, one betrayal, one dismissal at a time. And when we bury our monarchs in gold and legend, who gets buried deeper? The corpse or the truth? Philip I of Castile, the king who ruled for 2 months, the husband who broke a woman history would not forgive, the father of an emperor, the man who died after a glass of water, and was never fully buried, not in her heart, not in ours.